So, hello and welcome, dear friends, once again to the discussion of this series of lectures where we are dealing with soil microbiology and the elemental cycles of nature. And we are going to see some aspects of ecology also. So, we have already seen the carbon cycle, and today let us see the nitrogen cycle. I would like to tell you that this is a lecture which is divided into three parts. The first is introduction today, which I am going to discuss. The second will be the microorganisms which are involved in it. And the third is somewhat about the molecular level, which talks about the NIF genes and the oxidation states of nitrogen and how it is recycled in the nature. So let's begin to understand the nitrogen cycle as one of the most important biogeochemical cycles of the nature. The elements which are there, that is chnops, which I call it as carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, phosphorus, all these elements, these are present in nature in certain forms and they are recycled throughout the system, that is the atmospheric system or the earth's atmosphere, ecology, we can say. These comprise of the biogeochemical cycles, out of which nitrogen is one of the important element which is constantly circulated through in the environment. Now these, if you see the elements nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, sulfur, etc., these are cycled. These are present in the form of either nutrients or either in the form of rock, soil, salt, etc., which are in the non-utilizable forms, or in the form of nutrients which we heterotrophs can use. So there is a very strong relationship between these compounds or the elements which are cycled throughout in the nature with respect to the food chain or the energy flow. So you can see here the producers, which are the major chunk of the players in the food chain. They produce, and while producing the energy they are utilizing these elements and they combine it to form some nutrient blocks or the cellular components, like let us say for if you are taking into consideration carbon, the cell wall is made up of it. If you are taking into consideration nitrogen, then DNA, proteins, amino acids, these are made up of nitrogenous compounds. So these producers, they are constantly utilizing, means they are trapping these elements, and then this trapped elements moves along the food chain, or there is a energy flow from producers to primary consumers, we can say here, which are the herbivorous animals, then the secondary consumers, which are the carnivorous animals, and the tertiary consumers, which are again the higher carnivores, which what they are doing is they continuously cycle these elements throughout the atmosphere, soil, troposphere, oceans, etc. These elements are present everywhere. Now the question is, you should consider here the law of thermodynamics, and the most important law, that energy is neither created nor destroyed. It is just transformed or converted from one form into the another. Nitrogen is no exception for this. So whatever nitrogen was present on this earth some billions or millions of years ago, the same amount of nitrogen is present today. Only its forms have been changed. With the growth in human population, you can say we are trapping more nitrogen inside our body, and when we will die off, we will be releasing it into the atmosphere back. But apart from this, on a daily basis, on a daily workshop basis, you can say the microorganisms, they play a very key role in the nutrient cycling. So what of nutrient recycling of these elements, which forms in total the biogeochemical cycles of nature. So what is this biogeochemical cycle? Biogeochemical cycles are the natural pathways by which these essential elements of living matter, they are circulated. Circulated means they are not allowed to remain trapped for longer duration of time. In my opinion, the only biggest concern of all these resources getting trapped and not being utilizable is at the bottom of the oceans. Whatever the activity goes on the top of the earth, and let us say on the top layer of the oceans, that is okay. because rains will be there, hydrogeo cycles in the form of rain, that is hydrogen cycle or the water cycle. Rain, it is also circulated all along the atmosphere. But what happens when there is dead and dying planktons or fishes or animals which are settling down at the bottom of the ocean? They are remaining trapped there. Then there is very less chance that that will be given back in the atmosphere. Apart from this, these biogeochemical cycles on the surface of the earth, on the soil, on the atmosphere, they are the natural pathways by which the essential elements are circulated, recycled, and made available by the producers to the primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers, and the life system it goes on. The term biogeochemical cycle is used for the consideration of the biological aspects, geological aspects, and the chemical aspects of these elements, how they are transformed, in which state they live in, and how they then are degraded. The entropy, if you just see the equation or the entropy definition, nothing is in a state of consistency, everything is moving towards disorder. So similarly, when there is something which is formed, it has to undergo a breakdown. DNA is formed inside a cell, replication, that is synthesis is there, and once the cell enters into a stationary phase and a death phase, whatever the type of life form it may be, humans, animals, plants, microorganisms, you have to understand that there always is a stationary phase and a death phase. In the death phase, the cells they die off, and all the elements, all the compounds which are trapped inside the cell, they are given out. From where we have acquired all these elements? I always say that just like water has a formula H2O, humans also have a formula of CHNOPS. So I have accumulated some thousands of carbon, some millions of hydrogen, nitrogen, so on. So when there is a death, phenomenon of death, all these elements are released back into the nature. But it is not as simple as that. Who is going to break these elements which we have accumulated for 70, 80, 90 years inside our bodies? It needs to be released back into the environment. Okay, by burning, one issue, when the person is buried or the dead and decaying, all cellular life forms in soil today, they are broken down by microorganisms. Microorganisms, they play a very important role in this nutrient recycling. So biogeochemical cycles, this refers to the biology of that element, the geology of that element, and the chemistry of that element. Some of the major biogeochemical cycles, they are the water cycle or the hydrologic cycle, carbon cycle. Water cycle, it is very important because not a single activity of the life is possible without water activity or moisture. The second is carbon cycle, which we have already seen, and how it forms a very important part of the energy source of the living systems, the carbohydrates or the carbon. When we say carbon and energy, so carbon is important. Similarly, third is nitrogen. It forms a very important component of proteins, amino acids, nucleic acids, etc. And the oxygen cycle. The producers of the ecosystem, they take up several basic inorganic nutrients from their non-living environment. Means, for example, if a plant is growing, plant is a living entity, it is growing by uptaking the nutrients from the soil. So as it goes on taking the nutrients from the soil, that is from a non-living environment, it is ecosystem. Several basic inorganic nutrients, they are uptaken. From where is this nutrient added into the soil? This is by the nutrient recycling, which is done by primarily microorganisms. Microorganisms, they form a very important part and parcel of the biogeochemical cycles, and these materials, they get transformed into biomass of the producer. What happens when a plant, it uptakes everything, it becomes a biomass. Then we, the primary consumers, herbivorous, let us say, like rabbit is there or elephant is there, purely herbivorous animals, they consume this biomass and become another type of biomass. Okay, so they become the primary consumers. And then on the rabbit is eaten by a tiger, and it is converted into another type of a biomass. But what is happening here from this nitrogen cycle perspective is the nitrogen from the soil is uptaken by the plant. A plant is consumed by a rabbit, let us say. The rabbit is consumed by a tiger. The tiger dies off. Then it is again decomposed in the soil. In the soil from where this plant basically uptook the nitrogen, there the dead tiger will add nitrogen. But it is not that easy as such, because that dead tiger has to be decomposed off. Dead tiger is just a symbolic example, try to understand. Like all the materials, living system, dead and dying leaf material, twigs, insects, they are one of the largest community of living system on this earth. And these insects, when they die and are added into the soil, they have to be converted back into the nitrogen to the environment, and that is done by decomposition or decaying, and that is carried out by the microorganisms. So you can see the materials, they get transformed into biomass and then by the producers, and the biomass one day when it will die has to be recycled back into the nature. So here, as I said, elements nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, all are equally important. Today we will be focusing on the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen, it is a naturally occurring element, and you can see here this carbon dioxide, it may be there, then nitrogen, it may be there. These are fixed by the cells. If you consider this as a cell, and with the help of energy, that is ATP, it is converted into biomass here. So nitrogen is no exception, an element which is fixed into the cells, fixed into the biomass. Now, as we are studying microbiology, we will be focusing mainly on conversion of the available nitrogen into biomass. If this was geology, then all the nitrogen which is trapped in the soil in the form of rocks, sediments, etc., that will be studied. That is also equally important. And if we are talking about chemistry, all the chemical reactions like the Haber process is there, which chemical reaction which forms nitrogen, ammonia, urea, fertilizer, artificial chemical fertilizers which are there, production of fertilizers, that is production of nitrogen. So that is the chemistry. On a global level, you have to consider biogeochemical aspect of nitrogen. But this is a microbiology class, so my perspective will be to tell you about what happens in the biological domain with respect to nitrogen. But as a student of science who deserves to aim for higher quest of knowledge for a good career, you should have all this global perspective, not only on the land but also in the ocean, what happens with the nitrogen, not only on the soil but what happens with the atmospheric nitrogen, so on and so forth. But due to the limitation of this discussion with respect to the curriculum of your university, I will be dealing only with the biological perspective. But I have opened a window for you to go and explore the geological and the chemical and also maybe the physical aspects of nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen, what is nitrogen? Nitrogen is a tough thing to break. It is not as simple as, it's as good as a inert noble gas. It is not, but it is just like that. Nitrogen is a naturally occurring element, and that is essential for the growth and reproduction in both plants and animals. It is a very important element for the growth of plants and animals. Now see, in the atmosphere, 78% of the gas is made up of nitrogen. Around 20% is oxygen. Still when we breathe in and breathe out, humans, I am saying, we cannot take nitrogen. 78% is nitrogen. We cannot take nitrogen inside our body. If it was there, some system was there like oxygen. We have hemoglobin inside our body, the leg hemoglobin which is there, and iron containing molecule which is capable of carrying oxygen in the cells. So throughout our body the oxygen is circulated by hemoglobin and the iron containing heme moiety which is there. The point which I want to tell you is if there was something like iron, the nearest molecule is molybdenum. If our blood cells contained molybdenum, then while breathing, and if lungs, there was two chambers of lung, hypothesis, a fantasy, just imagine a fantasy, science fiction, two lungs, one is absorbing oxygen, other is absorbing nitrogen, and in the blood cells there are two types of blood cells, one is iron containing hemoglobin, another is molybdenum containing hemoglobin. what would have happened? All the nitrogen would have been fixed by molybdenum. Okay, why I am saying molybdenum? Because there are cells, bacterial cells, which have been shown to fix nitrogen just like we fix oxygen in our lungs and blood. So I will be telling that in the second and third lecture afterwards. Today we will just try to understand the nitrogen cycle and the introductory part of it. So as I said, it is a naturally occurring gas element which is very essential for the growth and reproduction of plants and animals. Okay, where it is found in plants and animals? It is found in amino acids, proteins, nucleic acids which are a part and parcel of all the hereditary material, which is the blueprint of life. We say DNA is the blueprint of life, and in DNA there are nitrogen bases. So without DNA a cell won't survive, or living system won't survive, or living system has no identity whatsoever without a DNA, and DNA is majorly comprised of nitrogen. Okay, so the life's blueprint for all the cells is associated with nitrogen, and many other organic and inorganic compounds inside the cell, they are also made up of nitrogen. Nitrogen is found in the soil, in some mineral deposits, and in organic compounds. Nitrogen is usually prepared by removing hydrogen by chemical reactions, by in chemistry, in research, but it can also be formed by various types of natural process also, like lightning. I'll come to that. Lightning converts the nitrogen in the air into nitrous oxide, and when it rains, nitric acid is formed. But apart from that, there are many chemical reactions by which nitrogen can be produced. So all this make up to the availability of nitrogen on the Earth's atmosphere. Earth as a globe, its atmosphere, land, soil, oceans, everywhere when you see, these are the areas where nitrogen is to be found. Now this nitrogen cycle, if you see, or the utilization, the biochemistry of it, metabolism, pathways, or anything wherein it circulates, it has to be utilized and it has to be produced. Just like money, we earn money because we want to spend money. So nitrogen is trapped, is formed, converted into one form because it has to be used, and once its use is over, it has to be released back into the environment. So there is a assimilatory process of nitrogen, there is a dissimulatory process of nitrogen. So this is how nitrogen is utilized on the face of this earth. Nitrogen is utilized by assimilation, and nitrogen is released for utilization again by dissimulation. So assimilatory nitrogen and dissimulatory nitrogen process is something which we have to keep in our mind when considering the nitrogen cycle. So assimilatory process is majorly in the biological domain, is used for biosynthetic reactions like amino acid production. It is not directly used in energy metabolism. Directly used like for ATP synthesis, it is a direct utilization, that is inorganic phosphate, phosphate is broken, phosphate is added, not like that. It is not directly used in energy metabolism, but all living organisms, they require nitrogen, and it is assimilated for amino acids, which forms the block measure of proteins. Then it forms a major chunk of nucleic acids, which is the hereditary material. So assimilation takes place like that. Now dissimulation is a reaction where the in a particular form, that is oxidized or reduced form, for certain reactions like ATP production or excretion of nitrogen, urea, formation of urea. Well, urea doesn't become a part of our body. Try to understand. ATP also is not a part of some organ. It is a molecule which is constantly needed for catalyzing or moving forward some metabolic reactions in terms of energy. Similarly, formation of urea. A reaction is there where urea is formed, that is dissimulatory process. Urea will be released off from the system or the body. So that is dissimulation. Nitrogen is taken up in the dissimulatory process in a particular form, which is mainly oxidized form or reduced form, and these reactions, they involve ATP production and excretion of the nitrogen product. Dissimulatory nitrogen is not incorporated into the physical or biochemical structure of the organism. It doesn't become a part. You don't have something let us say hairs, and they have nitrogen. No, it doesn't become a part of the system. Only there are some few organisms, microorganisms, which can utilize this dissimilatory process, which is not a part of the discussion here, but you can study it. So nitrogen, these uh, atoms, or the nitrogen atoms, they are constantly moving in a big circle from the air through the soil into oceans, into the plants and animals, and eventually back into the air. So this nitrogen cycle, why it is called a cycle? Because it is constantly moving into the air, into the soil, into the body, into the plants, and it is from thousands of years. This cycling is constantly going on. The whole process is called as nitrogen cycle. And all living things, they need nitrogen to develop and grow. We always talk about carbon and nitrogen source, a carbon source and a nitrogen source, because nitrogen is a very essential part of the genetic systems. So all the living things, they require nitrogen to develop and grow. Even through the earth's atmosphere, as I just said, it is made up of 78% of oxygen. But even thousands of years of evolution, we have not evolved into taking oxygen directly as we take oxygen, taking nitrogen directly as we take oxygen. Why? We have not evolved into uptaking nitrogen. Why? Because microorganisms, they have been doing that job for hours, from millions of years, and still they are doing. Plants and animals cannot utilize this. In the plants are also just like us, they cannot directly utilize the nitrogen from the air. Because why that is so? All this is facilitated by microorganisms in the soil. Why nitrogen cannot be uptaken? You can see here, nitrogen has triple bond. There are three bonds here. Though the majority of the air we breathe is nitrogen, most of the nitrogen in the atmosphere is unavailable for use. Only they have to be converted into utilizable form by some way or the other, and that is the food chain or the energy flow system. This is because there is a triple bond between the two nitrogen molecules, N2, and it makes it relatively inert, just like the noble gas. So plants, they will have to draw their nitrogen from the nitrogenous compounds dissolved in soil. From question is, from where is it coming in soil? In soil, there are various types of microorganisms. We will categorize into two, symbiotic and non-symbiotic, and they are constantly making out some decaying and decomposing activities, which makes available free nitrogen for the plants to uptake. Secondly, there is a nitrogen reservoir in the soil, minerals, a mineral, the geological aspect, the geological perspective, that also can be uptaken by the root nodules, xylem, phloem. You know the capillary action of these tissues, and they have a very great potential to supply the through capillary action to the tip of the tree. So that is the botany aspect which you should know very well. Anyway, the point is, there is a reservoir of nitrogen in the soil, and that is not freely available. That is made by the microorganisms. So plants must use nitrogen from the nitrogenous compounds dissolved in the soil, and animals, they get their nitrogen by eating these plants or eating other plants, or eating other animals which eat these plants. So that is how the food chain it works. So the nitrogen, it gets into the soil and it is dissolved and it is uptaken. The question is, how does it get there? The nitrogen gets into the soil by many ways. A small quantity of nitrogen is added into the soil continuously annually during rainy season by lightning. You can see here 5% of the nitrogen. Now this pie chart tells you the mechanisms by which nitrogen is added in the soil. Nitrogen is added in the soil at the level of 5% by lightning. Fossil fuels, they contribute to 25% of the nitrogen in the soil. Fossil fuels which have been, maybe dinosaurs, let us say, they were dead and they were buried into the soil. Huge trees, many animals which got extinct, they got dead, and now they have become fossil fuels. Aircraft, when it flies, aircraft engines, they also fix the nitrogen they release, and some 0.5%. Biomass burning, on this earth we burn biomass, we burn wood, we burn in the thermal plant in any place if you go, you'll see large chimneys excreting smoke. So biomass burning contributes to 5.9% of the nitrogen in the soil or in the atmosphere. Agriculture, that is production of fertilizers, chemical fertilizers we produce, and this agricultural input, it gives rise to 1.6% of nitrogen. And soils, the mineral activity in the soil, they harbor 3.3% of nitrogen in the soil. So this is the available, how nitrogen is made available in the environment. So nitrogen gets into the soil by many different ways: by lightning, fossil fuel already present, aircraft, and biomass burning, agriculture, the mineralization process which is going out in the soil is also there. Lightning, it is one of the important, though it's very negligible, 5%, but still negligible but significant. Okay, negligible in terms of mathematical value, but it is very significant. A small quantity of nitrogen is added into the soil by lightning. How does that thing happen? Lightning changes the atmospheric nitrogen into nitrogen dioxide, which is soluble in water. So nitrogen, atmospheric N2, is converted into nitrogen dioxide, and the nitrogen oxides, they dissolve in the rainwater when the rainy season. Lightning is there in rainy season only, and when rains they fall, it becomes nitric acid, and nitric acid is added into the soil. The rest of the nitrogen in the soil, it comes from bacteria. The bacteria, they are the only living things. Remember this line, this is very important for you to understand. Bacteria, they are the only living things capable of getting nitrogen directly from air. From the air, they have the capacity to fix nitrogen. How do they do that? We will be seeing in the next lecture. As we have lungs and hemoglobin and iron, they have cysts, molybdenum and leg hemoglobin. It's an interesting, beautiful concept. We will see it afterwards. So bacteria are the only living things which are capable of getting nitrogen directly from the air. This process of the bacteria converting the atmospheric nitrogen into utilizable nitrogen, either by associating with the systems which need this nitrogen. Which are the systems which need this nitrogen? They are plants. So either by associating with the plants, which we call it as symbiotic nitrogen fixer, or by the non-symbiotic mode, by free living mode also. So this process of making the atmospheric nitrogen utilizable for the plants is called as nitrogen fixation, which is done by a specific type of, there are various 3 to 4 5 reactions. Each step of the reaction is catalyzed by an enzyme, and that enzyme is harbored inside a microorganism. So there are certain kinds of bacteria in the soil which can extract nitrogen from the air. So if you just see here, I will zoom into it. Let us zoom it. So I hope you can see now here. So you see the atmospheric nitrogen photosynthesis we saw in carbon, the role of photosynthesis we saw in the carbon cycle. Now atmospheric nitrogen, you see the process. This is completely the biogeochemical cycle in one picture. I am trying to give you a sort of a global picture of how nitrogen is circulating in the environment, how nitrogen moves in the environment. You can see nitrogen is fixed by various ways. First is the fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizers, chemical fertilizers which are added in the soil all over the world. Now try to understand, not all is utilized by plant, most of it remains in the soil, and that when the rain falls, all this is carried down into the sea. So industrial, we will call it as an industrial process of nitrogen fixation, fertilizers. The second is plants which are uptaking the nitrogen fixed by the bacteria. Atmospheric nitrogen is fixed by the soil bacteria, and plants, they uptake it. There are two types of bacteria. One is symbiotic. You see this my hand signal cursor. So rhizobium, it is a symbiotic one, and azotobacter, clostridium and certain algae, they are the non-symbiotic nitrogen fixers. These fix the nitrogen. Then by the capillary action, the plants, they uptake it. The plants, they uptake the nitrogen. These plants, they are consumed by the herbivores, which they urinate, they defecate, excreta, they die off, and all this becomes the soil organic matter. The soil organic matter which is then decayed, this primary consumers or anything. This is just symbolic. This animal is symbolic. It can be insect, it can be humans, it can be anything which is dead and decaying residue, excreted, its excreta added in the soil, converted by microorganisms into soil organic matter. Okay, see here, now it is converted into soil organic matter, and there are various process here: ammonification, nitrification, immobilization, denitrification. We will see this in steps in the next lecture. Here you just try to understand the global perspective of the nitrogen cycle. So the dead and decaying, they become the soil organic matter. This soil organic matter, when it is decomposed, it releases nitrites, nitrates, ammonia, which is again absorbed by the plants, and the cycle continues in one level over there. This soil organic matter may also be deposited into the soil, that is chemically it can be a mineral deposit in the soil, which becomes fossil fuels. Okay, here when you see the atmospheric type of nitrogen fixation, the lightning, as I just said, the rain, cloud, here nitrogen, it gets fixed. When lightning is there, nitrogen is converted into nitrous oxide, and when it rains, it is added into the soil in the form of nitric acid, HNO3. Here it is in the organic, and in the soil that will also be converted. So all this, if you just see in brief, this whole cycle is in 5 steps. The atmospheric nitrogen is fixed by the bacteria called as nitrogen fixation. Then this soil bacteria, they converted it into NO2, NO3, that is nitrite, nitrates, nitrification. Then these nitrites and nitrates are absorbed by the plants, and these plants, they fix or they immobilize that inside their leaves or fruits, etc., seeds. That is called as assimilation, but it is not immobilized yet, because it is just assimilated, because herbivores, they will be consuming these plants, and once they consume it, then there is release of urea, they are dyed, so they become soil organic matter, which is called as ammonification. And during the soil decomposition, the nitrates, they are released back into the environment, and that is called as denitrification. So that is how the nitrogen, it recycles in the environment. So we have been seeing the global perspective here. Yes, we have been seeing the global perspective of nitrogen cycle. So this is how nitrogen, it circulates in the atmosphere. Okay, so all this is carried out primarily by bacteria. There are certain group of bacteria which convert the nitrogen into nitrogenous compounds. They are called as the nitrifying bacteria. They are called as the nitrifying bacteria. The process is called as nitrification. The details of each step we will see in the next lecture. Try to understand only the reactions. Here you can see the biological nitrogen cycle is there in prokaryotes as well as plants. If you see the prokaryotes, they are carrying all types of reactions, whereas plants, they have only certain limitations, like they cannot do the denitrification process. The plants, they cannot go for the NMOX or the anaerobic ammonia oxidation, which is called as NMOX. That is only done by bacteria. Denitrification is done by bacteria. So all the steps. Now nitrogen, try to understand it, it exists in various oxidation states. Nitrogen is a very interesting and a complex molecule. It exists in some various some 11 oxidation states, I think. So that will be discussed in the third lecture. And this transformation of nitrogen from one oxidation state to another oxidation state is carried out by microorganisms. So one of the group of bacteria, they are called as nitrifiers. Nitrosifiers is another group of bacteria. Ammonifiers, they are the another group of bacteria. So each group of bacteria, they carry out a specific reaction because they have specific enzymes for that. And each enzyme is a part of a complex gene system called as the NIF genes. But here just see what is happening with the nitrogen. Nitrogen from the air fixed into the soil, and this gets converted into nitrates, that is called as nitrification. Plants absorb the nitrates and they turn into a more complex nitrogen like proteins, amino acids, etc. Bacteria, they help the return of this nitrogen into the atmosphere. Bacteria in the soil, they decompose the animal waste, urine. All the animals, they urinate. What is urine? Urine is urea, a nitrogenous compound. All the living systems, it may be plant, animals, microorganisms, insects, they have a tendency to excrete urine, and this urea forms a part of the nitrogen cycle. So this is again added in the soil. Nitrifying bacteria, they turn this urea into ammonia, ammonia into nitrites. There are other types of bacteria also which are called as the denitrifying bacteria, which convert these nitrates back into nitrogen gas. Now this is only done by microorganisms. No plants can do that, no humans can do that. All these different steps, they form a big huge cycle called as the nitrogen cycle. And as time passes on this earth, as there is a biogeochemical turn of events, that is seasons, over the time, bacteria in the soil, they return almost the same amount of nitrogen which was converted into biomass. The bacteria in the soil, they return almost the same amount of nitrogen to the air as other bacteria they take up from the air. Means there is a balance. There is a balance of the nitrogen being fixed and the nitrogen being released. This keeps the nitrogen content of the earth and its atmosphere in a very perfect balance. Try to understand that. Unfortunately, we humans, we are interfering with the natural balance with overuse of artificially produced nitrates and chemical fertilizers in the agricultural sector. So use of biofertilizers is the only solution, but the processes, they are very slow. But as we are increasing in our population, as we are increasing in our needs and greeds, we are disturbing the nature's ecological balance. And this is one of the perspectives which you have to understand while studying the nitrogen cycle. These 5 reactions, we will be dealing it in detail in our next lecture. Each reaction will be seen through the perspective of a microorganism, through the perspective of a bacteria, and how the nitrogen is very meticulously, very promptly, very sincerely circulated and recycled in the environment from the atmosphere to the atmosphere by the microorganisms we will be seeing. So before these nitrates can be converted into atmospheric nitrogen, they are often carried off by the soil or rain into irrigation. I am talking about chemical fertilizers. What happens with the chemical fertilizers? When they are added in the soil, they are added in excess amount, and these, before the chemical fertilizers can be converted into nitrates and they can be released into the atmosphere, rain falls, they are carried, leached into the seas and oceans. We are adding chemical fertilizers just before rainfall. Rain falls, unutilized, large portion of it is flowed to the rivers, ponds, into the sea. These dissolved nitrates, these are called as dissolved nitrates, and they even go down into the groundwater. In some parts of the world, we have already seen that humans and animals, they are already consuming huge amount of nitrates. If you see your bore water, you just go for a test of nitrite and nitrates, huge amount of nitrite and nitrate, they are present primarily due to the excessive use of chemical fertilizers on this earth. Okay, so the drinking water has already become chemically unsafe for consumption. These excessive amount of nitrates, when they reach the rivers and lakes, they cause algae to grow. When there is huge amount of nitrite and nitrate added in the water, algal blooms are there. You see most of the rivers today, they have this algae grown over the surface. Why? Because it contains huge amount of nitrites and nitrates. From where are these nitrites and nitrates coming? They are coming from overflow, that is the overflow of rainwater. This overabundance of algae, what is the harm in algae then? They use too much of oxygen in the water. When they are growing in the water, they will use up oxygen, and the life of the biological community inside the water, when the oxygen level fails off, the life in the water, they will die off. This is the biggest hazard, and how we are ecologically imbalancing the whole thing. So this nitrogen cycle in great detail we will be seeing with respect to each step. As you can see, the herbivores, waste, urine and feces, there are decomposers, there are producers, these are the producers, there are decomposition, nitrogen fixation is there in the bacteria, symbiotic and non-symbiotic is there, nitrification, assimilation, denitrification, each step in detail we will be seeing in our next lecture. And you should remember that nitrogen is found 78% of the air is made up of it, and is found very abundantly in atmosphere, but we cannot use it. We cannot use it. And why we cannot use it? Because of its complex nature. And the nitrogen cycle, all these cycles which you are seeing on my background, each step is involving a microorganism, which we will be seeing in our next lecture, that is the role of microorganisms in the nitrogen cycle. Each step, I will be splitting this nitrogen cycle into 5 steps, and each step is made up of a reaction which is catalyzed by an enzyme which is present inside a microorganism. And all the microorganisms which collectively harbor these enzymes, enzymes are proteins, proteins are synthesized by a process called as protein synthesis, in which DNA transcription and translation is involved. So DNA is involved in the enzymes. Nitrogen fixing enzymes, they are also containing some DNA. That segment will be called as a gene, and that gene is called as NIF gene, which will be a part of my third lecture. So nitrogen cycle first part, introductory part, ends here. I would recommend you to go through this lecture once again till the time you understand the very basics of it, so that you can enjoy the role of microorganisms in my next lecture. And each step is meticulously, very sincerely carried out by variety of bacteria. So till then, study well, listen, read, write, use the links given below. Here I have given many links at the bottom of this lecture, and you can use that for your preparation of notes and higher domain of understanding. So till the time we venture into the next lecture, goodbye, see you soon.